Thank you very much, Professor, for the introduction. Mori, Professor Naito, distinguished members of the audience, good afternoon to all of you. It's good to be in this prestigious university. At the outset, I'd like to thank Doshisha University and for giving me the opportunity of addressing this distinguished people. It's always good to come to Kyoto, this great city of historic importance with hundreds of years of culture and tradition behind it. It's always a learning experience for any foreigner, I guess, like me, to come to Kyoto, because there's a lot that we can learn in Kyoto from the people of Kyoto, and to learn from this great tradition and culture that are behind this great city. So I regard this meeting of ours this afternoon as a two-way experience. While on one hand I will attempt to give you some information as to how we perceive certain developments taking place in the world, I also hope to learn from you through your questions and comments, and through the points that you might wish to raise in the end, so that I could also learn from you this afternoon. The matter that I will talk about is Turkey, my country, as a bridge between East and West, between Europe and Asia, between Europe and the Middle East, and between Islam and Christianity. And recent controversy regarding the so-called clash of civilization, and something that we in Turkey, in conjunction with some others, have initiated a new concept called the Alliance of Civilizations. In this topic, I will also refer to some issues, some foreign policy issues that are important for Turkey. I'm sure you'll find that interesting to learn more about Turkey's foreign policy as a predominantly Muslim country, yet a democratic and a secular country. I also wish to give you some information on various other aspects of Turkey as a country, like its economy, so that you could perhaps have a better picture of Turkey. I will try to make my presentation as brief as I can, because I'd like to leave ample time for your questions, for any comments that you may make, or any objections that you may forward. So this way, I'm hoping that our meeting this afternoon will be much more interesting, fruitful, and mutually beneficial. Now, we, of course, all heard about the concept of Cold War that emerged after the Second World War, and that cast a dark shadow over much of the world throughout the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s and 70s. The early years of 70s, as a result of the Cold War, our world was divided into mainly a bipolar one. On one side called the West, and the other opposing side was the East.
As
There are also the so-called third world countries, but despite their numbers, their large numbers, their weight in international relations and their impact had been quite minimal. Till the early 70s, what we had was one bloc, the Western bloc, opposing the other one, seeing the other one as adversary and even as an enemy. The division at that time was more so in the line of political philosophy and ideology. There were so-called communists on one side and capitalists on the other side. It was the perception of enemies in most part of the world at the time. You will recall that Churchill, soon after the Second World War, termed the Eastern Bloc as Iron Curtain, behind Iron Curtain. And at a later time, President Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And for the people in Eastern Bloc countries, it was exactly the opposite. The West, the imperialist, expansionist, capitalist West was the enemy, and they were pursuing a policy of world hegemony. This picture started changing in early 70s. The relations between the two blocs became less hostile, and the new era, which was termed by the French word détente, was introduced. And then came 80s, the developments in world arena became faster and faster. We saw developments that nobody could imagine, nobody could foresee before, like the fall of Berlin Wall, and afterward the disintegration of the once mighty Soviet Union. Only the perception of enemy changed. Former adversaries became friends and even allies in the same defense organization. We saw former Soviet Union members like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czech Republic becoming members in NATO. So all of a sudden NATO and the West were left without any enemies, so to speak. The enemy disappeared. The former enemies, as I said, became partners and allies in the same defense organization. Hostility and enmity along the lines of political ideologies gave way to something else. But beginning maybe in the 90s more so, we witnessed a new development in the world. It was the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and resulting terror. This perception of enemy in the minds of some people switched from one side to the other. There were no longer communist enemies, but there was something else, maybe Islam or Islamic radicals. So in the aftermath of Cold War, belonging to a particular culture instead of class affiliation has gained importance in terms of defining people's political identities and nations' policies. Culture is a relative concept, and it is very difficult to determine where one culture ends and the other starts. Thinkers, but also philosophers of ancient world, use the word civilization as a more inclusive concept. So now the problem suddenly was along the line of culture and civilization and religion instead of political ideology. People started saying that to the others that while you belong to another civilization, you belong to another religion, so you're not one of us, you're on the other side, you are our adversary. Unfortunately, man is still far from reaching an understanding of a common human civilization which by its nature is all-inclusive. Today, some prefer to think civilization as a divisive force rather than a common base for a mutual understanding. This religion, as distinct civilizations with irreconcilable differences among them, refuses to acknowledge the rich diversity in human culture. This school also sustains offensive generalizations and misperceptions about peoples of other countries or faiths and seeks cultural uniformity by keeping out the other. Especially in recent years, the fabric holding the international community together has come under considerable strain because of polarization, intolerance, extremism, and discrimination. A considerable portion of the world's population continues to be portrayed as the cause of a clash among civilizations. Many societies feel left out of the international system. While globalization has achieved improved standards for large parts of the world, many communities have not benefited from its advantages and enabling nature. A new theory was designed and introduced called the clash of civilizations. They implied that not only a competition but a conflict between different civilizations is inevitable. So it was no longer capitalists versus communists, as was the case during the Cold War years, but now it was Christians versus Islam. Of course, not all Christians and not all Muslims felt this way. Not all of them saw one another or the other side as enemy, but there were and there are still considerable groups both in Christian and Islamic world that feel this way, that see the other side as an antithesis to one another. This perception of the clash of civilizations became even stronger, and the divisions became even deeper after the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. in 2002. American policies in Iraq and in Afghanistan also contributed to the fear among the certain segments of the population in Islamic world. This division has become even more dangerous, especially after the 9/11 attacks. So much so that President Obama, when he visited Ankara and then a few months later Egypt, he made two speeches, one at the Turkish parliament and one in a university in Cairo. And in both speeches, he felt the necessity to articulate that Christians do not regard Islam or Muslims as enemies. Many of you will recall when he was making his speech at the university in Cairo, when he said, and I remember the words he used very clearly, he said, "Islam is not our enemy." He reminded the audience that there were hundreds of, I think a few hundred millions of people of Islamic faith within the United States. That the president of